She told me she didn't need the rent tonight, she needed me. And in that moment, everything changed. The first time I stepped into the old apartment building, I didn't expect it to feel like stepping into another world. The hallway smelled faintly of polished wood and old books, mixed with the warm, comforting scent of vanilla that seemed to follow me from floor to floor. My suitcase wheels clicked softly against the worn wooden floor, and I couldn't help noticing the way the light from the antique wall lamps flickered across the faded wallpaper. It was cozy, almost too quiet, as if the building itself was holding its breath. She appeared at the top of the staircase, her silhouette framed by the golden light of the hallway. I couldn't help but notice the quiet confidence in the way she stood, shoulders back, head held just high enough to suggest ease and authority, but her hands rested lightly on the railing, betraying a gentle vulnerability. She was beautiful in a way that didn't demand attention, it was graceful, effortless, a presence that lingered in your awareness without forcing itself. Her dark hair was swept loosely into a bun, and a few strands had escaped, softening the sharp lines of her face. "Hello," she said, her voice calm, smooth, but with a slight tremor that made it feel oddly human, warm. "You must be the new tenant. I'm your landlady." She smiled as she extended her hand, and the brief contact, the softness of her fingers, the way they rested lightly in mine, left a curious warmth lingering on my skin. It was nothing overt, nothing that would be noticed by anyone else, but I felt it all the same. She handed me the keys, her fingers brushing mine just a fraction too long. I told myself it was incidental, a coincidence, but the faint pulse of her warmth stayed with me. There was something in the way she looked at me, an unreadable depth, a spark of curiosity that mirrored my own. Her eyes were dark, thoughtful, and for a moment I wondered what stories they held, what small secrets lived behind that measured smile. As I explored my new apartment, I noticed traces of her life everywhere, a framed photograph on the mantel showing a couple laughing, the carefully placed plants along the windowsill, the faint aroma of lavender lingering in the corners. Each detail seemed deliberate, personal, a quiet invitation into her world. She followed me briefly, offering tips about the building, her voice occasionally light with humor, sometimes dipping into something softer, almost vulnerable. Even in these small interactions, I felt the first flicker of an unspoken tension. Her presence was both comforting and unnervingly magnetic, like standing too close to a candle. The warmth draws you in, but you instinctively notice the heat, the risk of getting burned. I left that evening with my keys tucked into my pocket, her gaze lingering in my memory, and a strange, persistent curiosity knotting itself in my chest. I didn't know it yet, but something unspoken had passed between us in those first moments, something delicate, fragile, and quietly compelling, that would pull both of us deeper into a story neither of us could have predicted. The next morning, sunlight poured through the thin curtains of my new apartment, catching dust motes that danced lazily in the warm glow. I was still unpacking when a soft knock came at the door. She was standing there, a basket of freshly baked bread cradled in her arms, the aroma of yeast and honey curling into the room like an invitation. "Thought you might like something for breakfast," she said, her voice gentle, almost shy, yet confident in the small way she moved. She handed me a loaf, her fingers brushing mine in that subtle, fleeting way that made my chest tighten just a little. She lingered on the threshold, not leaving but not fully stepping in either, like she was testing the air between us. We moved into the kitchen, and the quiet hum of the building became our companion. She poured tea into delicate porcelain cups, the soft clink of china punctuating the silence. I noticed the faint tremor in her hands as she set the cups on the table, a small but telling detail. It was the sort of imperfection that made her human, approachable, yet fascinating. "I've lived here for quite a while," she said, finally, her gaze momentarily dropping to the table before returning to mine. There was a vulnerability there, subtle, not forced, that hinted at a life lived in quiet observation. She told me about the building, about the tenants who had come and gone, about her late husband in fragments, a laugh here, a sigh there. Each word carried a weight, a story, a history that she seemed willing to let me glimpse but not fully hold. I listened, drawn in by the cadence of her speech, the way she hesitated just slightly before certain memories, as if guarding them carefully. I found myself leaning closer without realizing it, captivated not by the words alone but by the person behind them, the warmth in her eyes, the curve of her smile, the way her fingers lingered on the edge of the table. At one point, our knees brushed under the small kitchen table. It was accidental, I told myself, yet a shiver ran through me at the contact. She glanced down, then back up, and I swear I saw a flicker of acknowledgement in her eyes, a subtle recognition of the unspoken connection threading between us. The conversation flowed effortlessly, yet there was tension in the pauses, the kind that carries unvoiced curiosity and burgeoning attraction. I noticed the way she would tilt her head slightly when listening, the soft way she laughed, the tiny adjustments of her scarf or sleeves that somehow felt intimate. Every detail was amplified in my awareness, every gesture loaded with a sense of potential, a hint that something was quietly shifting. By the time she left, the sunlight had softened, casting long shadows across the floor. I was left with the lingering scent of her perfume, the faint warmth where her hand had briefly touched mine, and a persistent echo of her voice in my mind. That morning, a simple conversation became more than introductions, it became a thread, delicate yet unbreakable, pulling me toward her in ways I couldn't yet understand. Something had begun between us, a quiet, unspoken curiosity, a subtle tether of attention and emotion that would grow heavier with every passing day. And I found myself strangely eager to follow it, no matter where it might lead. The storm hit just as evening was settling in, rain hammering against the windows with a steady, insistent rhythm. I hadn't expected to be trapped inside, but there she was, standing in the doorway with a small, amused smile. "Looks like the building has decided to keep you here tonight," she said softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. There was something in her tone, not teasing, exactly, but intimate, almost conspiratorial, that made my pulse quicken. We moved to the living room, where she had already lit a few candles. Their soft glow flickered across the walls, casting shadows that danced lightly over the worn furniture and framed photographs. The smell of rain mixed with the subtle scent of her perfume, a combination that was surprisingly grounding, comforting, and somehow stirring all at once. I sat across from her on the sofa, my hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea she had made, feeling the heat radiate into my palms. Conversation started lightly, about the weather, the building, old tenants, but gradually, it deepened. She spoke quietly of her past, of long-lost dreams and small regrets, her words careful but open enough to invite me in. I listened, noticing the rise and fall of her chest, the delicate way her fingers curled around her own cup, and the small, almost imperceptible tremor in her hands whenever she lingered on a painful memory. There was honesty in her vulnerability, and it made my own heart ache with a strange mixture of admiration and protectiveness. At some point, her hand brushed mine accidentally, or so we claimed. The contact was brief, yet electric. I felt the warmth of her skin, soft and steady, a pulse that seemed to sync with my own. Neither of us pulled away immediately, our eyes met, holding the gaze longer than was necessary, and I realized that the quiet tension between us had shifted into something tangible, something neither of us was ready to name aloud. The storm outside raged, but inside, time seemed to stretch and bend around us. A silence fell, not awkward, but intimate, filled with the sound of rain on the roof, the gentle flicker of candlelight, and the quiet beat of two hearts noticing one another. I wanted to reach out again, to bridge the distance, but the hesitation in me, the awareness of the age gap, of propriety, of everything unspoken, kept my hand still. And yet, I felt her longing in the subtle way she leaned toward me, her shoulder brushing mine when she reached for the sugar. She let me read a letter she had kept hidden in a drawer, a small, folded piece of her history. The trust implicit in that gesture, the soft, lingering way her fingers brushed mine as she handed it over, made my chest tighten. It wasn't just curiosity anymore, it was connection, fragile but undeniable, threaded with shared vulnerability. By the time the rain eased, I realized that something had shifted irrevocably between us. What began as a simple evening trapped indoors had become a quiet revelation, that our lives, in their separate rhythms and distances, were beginning to entwine. And as she smiled softly at me before retreating to her own space, I found myself acutely aware of the lingering warmth where her hand had touched mine, and of the tension that promised there was far more yet to come. It was late that night when the apartment felt unusually quiet, the storm from earlier having left only the distant patter of rain against the windows. I had been lingering in the living room, pretending to read a book, but my attention kept drifting toward her. She moved around her kitchen, a soft glow from the lamp illuminating the graceful lines of her face, the gentle curve of her shoulders. There was something vulnerable in the way she moved tonight, something I hadn't seen before, a quiet tremor beneath her usual composure. She turned toward me suddenly, her eyes catching the lamplight, glistening in a way that made my breath hitch. I don't need the rent tonight," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The words hung in the air, teasing and fragile. I frowned, thinking I misheard, but then she stepped closer, and the warmth of her presence brushed against me, undeniable. "I need you," she added, softer this time, almost as if she were afraid to truly say it aloud. The room seemed to shrink around us. I could feel the faint heat radiating from her, subtle and steady, as if her body was offering an unspoken invitation. My own hands, resting on the arms of the chair, itched to move, but hesitation held me in place. I wanted to reach out, to brush a strand of hair from her face, to take her hand, but the weight of propriety, the age gap, and the sudden intimacy made every instinct fight with the other. She stepped closer still, just enough that the edge of her shoulder brushed mine. My heart raced, not from desire alone, but from the raw vulnerability in her gaze. There was no expectation, no demand, just an honest, trembling confession of loneliness, of need, of trust. It was the kind of moment that could shift everything between two people, that could open doors into a connection neither of us fully understood yet. Her hand hovered near mine on the table, and when it finally brushed against my fingers, it was electric. A warmth spread from the point of contact, subtle but insistent, the kind that makes you aware of every small sensation, the faint pulse beneath the skin, the softness of her touch, the delicate pressure that lingers long after it's gone. I swallowed hard, acutely aware of the way her eyes never left mine, the quiet desperation in them that made it impossible to look away. We sat there in silence, the air thick with unspoken words. The gentle flicker of the lamp cast a soft glow across her features, highlighting every nuance, the way her lips parted slightly, the tiny line of worry in her brow, the tilt of her head as if silently asking me to bridge the gap between us. Every fiber of my being wanted to move closer, to ease the tension, to offer the comfort she was silently requesting. And yet, we didn't rush. We didn't need to. That confession alone, soft, hesitant, utterly human, was enough to change the shape of the evening, enough to shift the balance of our connection. In that moment, I realized that the slow burn we had been building was no longer just a possibility, it had become a living thing, delicate, fragile, and entirely unstoppable. The days after her confession felt different, charged, quiet, and full of an unspoken awareness that neither of us could ignore. I caught myself lingering at the edge of her apartment door longer than necessary, fumbling for words whenever she appeared, feeling the subtle pull of something I hadn't anticipated. Every glance, every brush of her hand, carried weight now. It wasn't just curiosity anymore, it was something heavier, something that demanded thought before action. I found myself overanalyzing every gesture. When she smiled, I felt a tension in my chest, a mixture of warmth and hesitation. Her hands lingered on objects, on the table, on my shoulder when she passed behind me, and I noticed every faint pulse of her warmth. Each time our fingers brushed, accidental or otherwise, I felt it as though a spark had traveled through my veins, yet I pulled back, reminding myself of the age gap, of propriety, and of the social expectations that loomed in the back of my mind. She noticed my hesitations. I could see it in the soft tilt of her head, in the quiet pauses that stretched just a fraction too long, in the almost imperceptible sigh she let slip when I didn't reach for her hand. She wasn't pushing, not in the way that demanded a response. She was careful, patient, testing the waters without forcing them, leaving the space for me to meet her halfway, or not. And every time I considered bridging that space, my mind raced with conflicting thoughts, desire and propriety, curiosity and caution, longing and self-doubt. One evening, she offered me a cup of tea while we sat on the sofa, the room dimly lit by the glow of a single lamp. The scent of jasmine from her tea mixed with the faint perfume lingering in the air, and I became acutely aware of the proximity between us. My hand brushed hers as I reached for the cup. We froze for a fraction of a second, the contact lingering, electric in its subtlety. She didn't pull away immediately, her gaze met mine with quiet intensity, as if asking permission without saying a word. Our silences grew heavier, yet never uncomfortable. They were filled with possibility. I felt the warmth radiating from her shoulder as she leaned slightly toward me, and I wanted to reach out, to close the distance, but hesitation rooted me in place. Each unspoken moment was a negotiation between my instincts and my caution, between the comfort of emotional intimacy and the fear of stepping too far too soon. Despite, or perhaps because of, this tension, our connection deepened. I began noticing the smallest things, the soft brush of her hair behind her ear, the gentle rise and fall of her breath, the way her eyes held my gaze a fraction longer when she laughed. Each observation was a reminder that her presence was slowly becoming indispensable, even as the uncertainty of crossing the invisible boundary gnawed at me. By the time she left that evening, a soft warmth lingered where our hands had brushed, and my mind replayed every gesture, every glance. Emotional hesitation had become its own kind of intimacy, quiet, charged, and profoundly alive. It was a slow burn that neither of us could ignore, and I realized that the weight of feeling, of hesitation, could be just as potent as the act of surrendering to it. That evening, the apartment smelled of fresh basil and garlic, the faint steam rising from the simmering pots on the stove curling lazily into the warm air. She had insisted we cook together, and I found myself surprised at how natural it felt to follow her movements. She moved with a grace that was effortless, each gesture measured but fluid, the tilt of her head as she tasted the sauce, the slight curve of her smile when I mimicked her stirring, the gentle brush of her fingers against mine as we reached for the same utensil. There was laughter that night, quiet and soft, but it carried a weight of relief and comfort. We joked about burnt garlic and clumsy chopping, yet every small mistake became a shared moment of intimacy. I noticed the way she leaned slightly toward me when our shoulders brushed, a subtle invitation that required no words, and I felt a warmth bloom in my chest that had nothing to do with the stove. As the meal took shape, our conversation deepened. She spoke of her fears, the solitude she had grown accustomed to, the judgment she anticipated from the world about her choices, the quiet longing she carried without admitting it. I listened, captivated, sensing the vulnerability she allowed herself to display. Her hands rested lightly on the counter or on the edge of the cutting board, occasionally brushing mine in that fleeting, electric way that had become familiar. Each touch was deliberate and tender, building a quiet bridge between us that neither words nor actions alone could achieve. When it was time to taste the sauce, she guided me to the counter, standing close enough that our knees brushed. I felt the gentle pressure of her shoulder against mine, the warmth radiating from her body, the subtle scent of her perfume mingling with the aroma of dinner. I wanted to lean into her, to let the tension between us ease for just a moment, but I paused, savoring the closeness without overstepping. She tilted her head toward me, her gaze soft but probing, and I understood the silent question she was asking, "Will you meet me here?" Her trust and patience were overwhelming. When she allowed herself to rest her head briefly against my shoulder while tasting the sauce, I felt an almost unbearable surge of tenderness. My hand hovered near her back, brushing lightly against her waist, and I realized that connection could exist without grand gestures, without declarations, just in the quiet, lingering contact and shared space between us. By the time the meal was ready, we had moved to the small dining table, plates steaming and hands occasionally brushing as we served ourselves. The room was warm, cozy, and alive with subtle intimacy. I caught her eyes in the soft lamplight, and in that moment, the unspoken tension, the hesitation, the slow burn pull between us seemed to crystallize into something palpable. We didn't rush, we didn't need to. The evening was enough, every glance, every laugh, every gentle touch, a quiet affirmation that we were no longer two separate lives orbiting one another, but a shared space of connection, fragile yet undeniably present. When the night ended, I lingered by the door, feeling the warmth of her hand as she bid me goodbye, the echo of her laughter in my ears, and the subtle thrill of intimacy in my chest. That evening had become a turning point, a moment of quiet, profound connection, where trust, warmth, and desire began to entwine, slow and deliberate, between us. The storm had passed, leaving the city streets glistening under the soft light of street lamps, but inside her apartment, the warmth lingered like an unspoken promise. That evening, we found ourselves on the couch, a shared blanket draped loosely over our legs, the faint scent of vanilla and lavender filling the room. It wasn't just the warmth of the blanket that kept us close, it was the quiet realization that, somehow, we had become indispensable to one another. We didn't speak at first. Silence stretched comfortably between us, punctuated only by the soft ticking of the clock and the distant hum of the city outside. I could feel her breath against my shoulder, steady and calm, and I realized I had been holding my own breath, caught in the gravity of her presence. Every small motion, her fingers brushing the blanket, the gentle tilt of her head toward mine, felt deliberate, a quiet language of trust and care that neither of us had needed to speak. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, barely more than a whisper. "I'm glad you stayed tonight," she said. The words weren't just gratitude, they were an admission of dependence, a fragile acknowledgement of need that made my chest tighten. I turned slightly to meet her gaze, catching the faint glimmer in her eyes, the warmth that radiated without a word. I reached for her hand, letting our fingers intertwine, and felt the subtle pulse, the gentle heat that had become so familiar in these quiet, charged moments. She rested her head lightly against my chest, and I could hear the rhythm of her heartbeat, slow and steady, merging almost imperceptibly with my own. The sensation was grounding and exhilarating at the same time, a reminder that intimacy wasn't just a matter of words or gestures, but of presence, of mutual acknowledgement, of allowing oneself to be seen fully. Her hair brushed my arm, soft and fragrant, and I felt an ache of tenderness that made me want to protect this fragile, beautiful connection we had built. We talked eventually, softly, about trivial things at first, the passing days, the mundane details of the building, the small frustrations and joys that colored our lives. But in each word, in each shared glance, there was an undercurrent of something deeper, the understanding that we had crossed an invisible line together, moving from curiosity and hesitation into trust, comfort, and affection. The blanket shifted slightly, and our knees brushed. I didn't flinch. She didn't either. Our hands remained intertwined, our shoulders just barely touching, and in that quiet proximity, I realized that the slow burn between us had finally arrived at a place of warmth and security. There was no need for urgency, no need for declarations. The connection was enough, steady, gentle, and profoundly satisfying. As the night wore on, we remained wrapped in that quiet intimacy, the apartment glowing softly around us. I felt her hand squeeze mine gently, a silent acknowledgement that we were no longer navigating this connection alone. And for the first time since I had arrived, I understood what it meant to belong, to someone's world, even in the smallest of ways. The storm outside was gone, but the calm and warmth we had found together promised something enduring, something quietly transformative. In the stillness, I realized that this story, our story, had reached its gentle, perfect conclusion. We had found each other not in grand gestures or dramatic confessions, but in the steady, patient unfolding of trust, touch, and quiet love. And that, I thought, was more powerful than anything else. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more slow burn romances that linger in the mind long after the video ends. Comment below, which moment between them felt the most real to you.